Night had already fallen over the tidewater fields of Virginia when the first coffin was lowered into the earth. The year was 1767. A thin fog rolled through the cemetery behind a small colonial church. Drifting between crooked gravestones and damp wooden crosses, lanterns flickered in the hands of silent parishioners. The minister stood beside the open grave reading softly from the Book of Common Prayer. Another burial, another soul committed to the ground. But as the coffin touched the bottom of the grave, something strange happened. Two of the men responsible for lowering the casket exchanged uneasy glances. The rope had gone slack too quickly. The coffin was too light. In 12 years, records would show that 157 burials took place in that churchyard. 157 coffins sealed and lowered beneath sacred ground. But when investigators finally began opening those graves decades later, they discovered something impossible. Many of the coffins were completely empty. No bodies, no bones, nothing but dust and silence. How could an entire church bury the dead without the dead? And more importantly, who was trying to hide what lay beneath those graves? Tonight, we begin unraveling one of the most disturbing religious mysteries buried in the soil of colonial America. But before we step into that shadowed churchyard, we need to understand the world that surrounded it. Colonial America in the mid-1700s was a place of rigid order and fragile stability. The British Crown ruled over 13 colonies scattered along the Atlantic coast. Society was structured sharply from top to bottom. Wealthy landowners dominated politics and commerce, while small farmers, indentured servants, and enslaved laborers lived under strict authority. Religion held communities together. In colonies like Virginia, the Anglican Church served not only as a spiritual guide, but also as a political institution. Church parishes collected taxes, recorded births and deaths, and maintained moral order. Ministers were respected figures, often among the most educated men in the region. Sunday sermons echoed through wooden churches across the countryside. Faith, obedience, and loyalty to the crown were preached from the pulpit. But beneath this orderly surface, tensions were quietly building. By the 1760s, colonial society was changing. Population growth had pushed settlements deeper into forest and frontier lands. Trade disputes with Britain were creating economic strain. The Proclamation Line of 1763 had angered colonists eager to expand westward, and whispers of resistance were beginning to circulate in taverns and meeting houses. The American Revolution was still years away, but the ground was already shifting. It was during this uneasy time that a small parish in eastern Virginia began recording an unusual number of deaths. At first, nothing about the records seemed alarming. Colonial life was dangerous. Disease swept through communities without warning. Fever outbreaks, smallpox, and contaminated wells often took lives quickly. Child mortality was tragically common. Hard winters and poor harvests could weaken entire settlements. So when the church burial ledger recorded several funerals within a single season, few people questioned it, but the numbers kept rising. By the early 1770s, the parish burial register showed an astonishing figure: 157 funerals in 12 years. For a rural parish of modest size, it was an extraordinary number. Still, the community continued attending funerals, listening to prayers, and lowering coffins into the ground. No one publicly objected. No one demanded to open the graves. And yet, scattered among letters and court records from the period, historians later discovered something troubling. Several witnesses claimed that some of the coffins felt strangely light. Others said the funerals were conducted unusually quickly. A traveling merchant wrote in his diary that the cemetery appeared overfilled with fresh earth, though no sickness was spoken of. And one parish clerk, writing privately to a cousin in Williamsburg, included a single, unsettling line: "I begin to suspect that something beneath our churchyard is not as the minister proclaims." For years, that suspicion remained nothing more than a quiet murmur. But eventually, someone decided to look deeper. To understand how this mystery began, we must return to the man who stood at the center of the parish during those years: Reverend Elias Whitford. Whitford arrived in Virginia in 1764, sent by Anglican authorities in London to oversee a struggling rural congregation. Courts describe him as disciplined, articulate, and fiercely loyal to the crown. He preached sermons about obedience, about divine order, about the dangers of rebellion and moral decay. Too many parishioners, He seemed like the perfect minister for an uncertain time. But Whitford also kept unusually detailed records, not only of baptisms and marriages, but of deaths. His burial ledger was meticulous: dates, names, witnesses, each entry written in careful ink. And yet, something about those entries would later trouble historians. Many of the listed individuals appear nowhere else in colonial records. No property documents, no tax rolls, no baptismal entries. It was as if dozens of people had died in the parish without ever having lived there. At the time, few questioned the minister's authority. Church records were treated with near-sacred trust. But there was one person who began noticing the inconsistencies. A young printer's apprentice named Nathaniel Hale. Hale lived several miles from the parish, working in a small Williamsburg print shop that produced pamphlets, sermons, and colonial notices. Through his work, he frequently handled parish announcements, burial notices, and public documents. One evening in 1775, Hale noticed something strange while reviewing several church burial notices sent for publication. The names seemed unfamiliar, not just unfamiliar to him, but unfamiliar to anyone in the surrounding counties. Curiosity led him to begin comparing the notices with public records, tax rolls, land deeds, shipping manifests. Again and again, the same pattern emerged: names of the deceased that appeared nowhere else. And when Hale quietly mentioned this to a local magistrate, the official reportedly gave him a simple warning: do not involve yourself in the affairs of the church. In colonial Virginia, that was not merely advice. It was a boundary. Church authority carried enormous weight. Questioning a minister could damage reputations, divide communities, and even bring legal consequences. So for a time, Nathaniel Hale remained silent. But the unease never left him. Because by the mid-1770s, the burial numbers had grown even higher, and whispers about the churchyard had begun spreading beyond the parish. Farmers passing by at night claimed they saw lanterns moving among the graves long after midnight. Gravediggers were reportedly dismissed after only a few weeks of work, and one former parishioner swore he heard something hollow when a shovel struck a coffin lid during a burial. Like knocking on an empty wooden box. Was it all rumor? Or was something darker being hidden beneath sacred ground? The truth would remain buried for years, until one man decided the graves needed to be opened. But that moment had not yet come, because in 1775, colonial America was on the edge of something far larger than a church mystery. War was approaching. Within months, the first shots of the American Revolution would echo at Lexington and Concord. Colonial governments would collapse. Militias would rise. Many records would disappear in the chaos. If a conspiracy had been unfolding inside that small Virginia parish, the coming war would make it even harder to uncover. Yet the question remained: why would a church bury empty coffins? Who were the 157 supposed victims? What secret required so many graves to hide it? Those questions are where our investigation truly begins. You're watching Liturgy of Darkness, where we uncover the hidden sins buried beneath history's sacred walls. If you enjoy cinematic historical mysteries like this one, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe to Liturgy of Darkness, like the video, and share it with someone who loves uncovering the darker side of history. Your engagement helps us continue researching and telling stories that history books often leave buried. And now, we want to hear from you. If a church buried more than 100 empty coffins, what do you think they were trying to hide? Secret burials? Smuggling operations? Or something even darker connected to the coming revolution? Leave your theory in the comments below, because in part 2, we'll follow the trail of evidence that led investigators to finally open one of those graves, and what they found inside changed the entire story. And once the first coffin was opened, the mystery of the 157 victims became far more terrifying than anyone expected. The mystery surrounding the parish graves did not disappear after the first suspicion surfaced. Instead, it deepened. By the winter of 1775, the American colonies were no longer merely restless territories under British rule. The atmosphere across Virginia had grown tense and uncertain. Taverns filled with whispered debates about taxation and royal authority. Pamphlets criticizing Parliament circulated quietly between merchants and farmers. Meetings held in courthouse squares began to sound less like discussions and more like preparations. Yet within the quiet boundaries of the rural parish church, Life continued to appear unchanged. Every Sunday, the wooden doors opened before sunrise. Families arrived on horseback or in simple wagons, their clothing smelling faintly of tobacco fields and wood smoke. Inside the church, long wooden pews faced a raised pulpit beneath tall rectangular windows. The architecture followed the familiar Anglican style used across colonial Virginia: whitewashed brick walls, simple timber beams, and a modest bell tower that could be heard across nearby farmland. Candles burned along the walls during early winter services, casting long shadows across the interior. Reverend Elias Whitford stood above his congregation, delivering sermons about obedience, loyalty, and divine order. Few questioned his authority. In colonial Virginia, the Anglican Church was not simply a place of worship, it was an arm of governance. Parish vestries oversaw local matters including poor relief, road maintenance, and tax collection. Church tithes were mandatory, and ministers often maintained close relationships with magistrates and wealthy plantation owners. To challenge a minister was, in many ways, to challenge the structure of colonial society itself. Nathaniel Hale understood this better than most. As a printer's apprentice in Williamsburg, he spent long days setting metal type for sermons, political notices, and trade announcements. Printing presses had become powerful tools in the colonies. Ideas moved faster than ever before, carried through pamphlets and broadsides that could reach towns hundreds of miles away. But printers also learned caution. Too much curiosity could attract dangerous attention. Still, the burial records from Whitford's parish continued troubling Hale's thoughts. The numbers alone seemed impossible. 157 burials within 12 years in a relatively small congregation suggested an epidemic or catastrophe, yet no colonial newspapers reported such a disaster. There were no known outbreaks severe enough to explain it. Even more troubling were the names. Many appeared nowhere else in Virginia's surviving documents, not in tax ledgers, not in shipping lists, not in parish baptism records. It was as if dozens of individuals had simply appeared for the sole purpose of dying. Late one evening, after the printing shop had closed, Hal began searching through a stack of older parish correspondence that had been delivered months earlier for publication review. Most were routine church notices, funeral announcements, marriage blessings, requests for supplies. But buried among them was something different: a folded sheet of paper sealed with dark wax. The document had never been printed. The wax had already been broken when Hale found it, suggesting someone had opened it before. Curious, he carefully unfolded the letter. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple inventory request written by Reverend Whitford to a supplier in Norfolk, but something about the wording felt strange. Certain phrases were unusually vague. Instead of naming specific items, the letter referred repeatedly to containers and deliveries requiring discretion. More curious still were several odd symbols placed beside certain limes, small triangular marks that looked almost like printers' alignment guides. Except they were not aligned with the text. Hale examined the symbols closely. Then a realization struck him. They were not printing marks. They were codes. In the printing trade, certain shorthand symbols were sometimes used to conceal sensitive instructions between publishers and political writers. Hale had seen them before in pamphlets criticizing British taxation, but finding similar marks inside a parish letter was deeply unsettling. Carefully, he copied the marked lines onto a separate sheet of paper. When arranged in a certain pattern, the phrases formed a second message hidden within the letter's ordinary text. The decoded lines read, "Deliveries to be received after midnight. Storage beneath the western foundation remains secure, once coffins required to maintain appearances." Hale stared at the words in silence. Coffins required to maintain appearances. The phrase echoed inside his mind long after he finished reading. If the message meant what it seemed to imply, the parish cemetery might never have been intended as a burial ground at all. It might have been something else entirely. But what could require such secrecy? The more Hal studied colonial records, the more he realized how powerful the church vestry truly was. Parish leaders often controlled local warehouses, roads, and dock permissions. Their authority extended into nearly every aspect of community life, and Reverend Whitford, as minister, held enormous influence over those decisions. Whitford also maintained connections beyond the parish. Letters preserved in Virginia colonial archives show that he corresponded frequently with merchants in Norfolk and even officials connected to the British colonial administration. At first glance, this seemed normal, but one detail raised concern. Several shipments recorded in Norfolk. Shipping manifests listed deliveries addressed to Whitford's parish not of books or church supplies, but of wooden crates and heavy iron hardware. None of those shipments appeared in official parish inventories. Where had they gone? Holé eventually decided that speculation was no longer enough. He needed to see the churchyard himself. Traveling to the parish was not difficult. Williamsburg lay only a day's ride away along dirt roads winding through tobacco plantations and pine forests. Along the way, Hale passed enslaved laborers, working fields under overseer supervision, wagon trains transporting cured tobacco to port cities, and small colonial farms struggling to survive a difficult winter. By the time he reached the parish grounds, evening shadows had already begun stretching across the cemetery. The church itself stood on a gentle rise overlooking open farmland. Its structure appeared ordinary brick walls weathered by years of coastal storms. Wooden shutters protecting tall windows, and a modest bell tower rising above the roofline. Yet something about the cemetery immediately felt unusual. Fresh mounds of soil were scattered across the churchyard. Far more than Hal expected. Some graves appeared so recently dug that the earth had not yet settled, but the spacing between them was strange. Instead of the neat rows common in colonial burial grounds, many graves were clustered unevenly near the western wall of the church. Hale approached one of the newest markers. Inscription was simple, just a name and a date. But once again, the name meant nothing to him. He had never seen it in any tax roll or parish document. A cold wind rustled through the cemetery grass. As Hal moved closer to the church building itself, another detail caught his attention. The western side of the structure looked different. Most Anglican churches of the period were built with solid brick foundations. But along this wall, several stones appeared newer than the rest. The mortar lines were slightly lighter, as if repairs had been made recently, or as if something had been added. Hale circled the building slowly. Near the base of the western wall, partially hidden by winter weeds, he noticed a narrow wooden hatch built directly into the foundation. It was small, barely large enough for a man to crawl through, and it was locked. Why would a rural church require a concealed entrance beneath its foundation? Before Hale could examine it further, voices drifted across the churchyard. Lantern light flickered between the trees. Several men were approaching from the road, carrying long wooden boxes on their shoulders. Even from a distance, Hallie recognized the shape immediately. Coffins. But there was something unsettling about the way they carried them. Not with solemn reverence, not like a funeral procession. The men moved quickly, quietly, as if they were transporting cargo rather than the dead. Hale stepped behind a large oak tree and watched. The group stopped beside the western wall. One of the men produced a key. Moments later, the small wooden hatch creaked open, and instead of lowering the coffins into graves, they carried them directly beneath the church. The hatch closed behind them. The lantern light disappeared. Hale remained frozen beside the tree, his heart pounding. If coffins were being stored beneath the church, then the graves above might truly be empty. But the question had grown far darker. What exactly was being hidden under that building, and who was powerful enough to organize such a deception for over a decade? The answer would come sooner than Hale expected, because the following night, driven by equal parts fear and determination, he returned to the churchyard with a lantern, a shovel, and a decision that would change everything. He chose a grave near the western wall. One of the newest. The soil was still loose. Each shovel of dirt felt heavier than the last. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. Finally, the metal edge of his shovel struck wood, the coffin lid. Hale hesitated only a moment before prying it open. The lid lifted slowly. The lantern light fell inside, and what he saw there did not reveal a body, but something far more shocking. Inside the coffin, carefully packed in straw, were dozens of sealed iron muskets. Nathaniel Hale did not breathe for several seconds. The lantern trembled slightly in his hand as its light fell across the contents of the coffin. No body, no bones. Instead, the interior was filled carefully with straw packing, and beneath it lay row after row of iron muskets, long, dark, perfectly preserved. Weapons, dozens of them. Hale slowly lowered the lantern closer. The metal gleamed faintly beneath the flame. Each musket had been wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The barrels were stamped with small markings he recognized from shipping records. British military manufacture. This was no accident. Someone had deliberately hidden a weapons shipment inside a coffin and buried it beneath a churchyard grave. The realization struck him with terrifying clarity. The empty coffins were never meant to hold bodies. They were containers for weapons. Hale quickly lowered the coffin lid back into place. The cemetery suddenly felt far less peaceful than it had only minutes before. If muskets were being hidden here, someone had to be moving them, and if someone was moving them, someone else might already know he was digging. The cold wind rustled the branches of the oak trees around him. For a moment, Hale thought he heard footsteps. He extinguished the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed the cemetery. Only the faint outline of the church remained visible against the night sky. Hale waited, listened. The wind moved again through the grass. Nothing else. Still, the feeling would not leave him, the feeling that he was no longer alone. After several tense minutes, he carefully replaced the soil over the grave and packed it down with the flat edge of his shovel. He could not leave evidence. If the wrong person discovered the disturbed earth, questions would follow immediately. And in Colonial Virginia, asking the wrong questions could be dangerous, especially when the church itself might be involved. By the time Hale finished covering the grave, sweat had soaked through his shirt despite the cold night air. He looked once more toward the western wall of the church. The small wooden hatch beneath the foundation remained closed, silent. Whatever lay beneath that building had just become far more important than he had imagined. But Hale understood something else now. This was no ordinary smuggling operation. Moving weapons through coffins required careful planning, trusted workers, and authority strong enough to prevent investigation. Only someone with real power in the parish could coordinate something like this. And one name rose immediately to the surface of Hale's mind: Reverend Elias Whitford. The minister who kept the burial records. The minister who signed the shipping requests. The minister whose churchyard contained 157 graves. He had gathered his tools and left the cemetery quietly. But the unease followed him the entire ride back to Williamsburg. Because if Whitford truly controlled this operation, then the conspiracy might reach far beyond a single rural church. The American colonies in 1775 were on the edge of open rebellion. Militia groups had begun organizing across Massachusetts and Virginia. Weapons were becoming difficult to obtain, especially under British oversight. Royal governors had started restricting the storage of gunpowder and military supplies. Hidden shipments of muskets would be valuable, extremely valuable. But for whom? For the British Crown? Or for the growing colonial resistance? Hale did not yet know. And that uncertainty made the situation even more dangerous, because either possibility could lead to treason. The next morning, Hale returned to his routine at the Williamsburg printing shop. He forced himself to act normally, sorting type, preparing paper sheets, adjusting the heavy iron press. But his thoughts remained fixed on the cemetery, on the coffin, on the weapons hidden beneath the church. At midday, a rider arrived carrying a bundle of new church notices for publication. Hale accepted the documents with steady hands. But as he sorted through the papers, his pulse quickened. One of the letters bore the familiar signature, Reverend Elias Whitford. The message was brief, a funeral announcement. Another burial scheduled for the coming Sunday. Hal stared at the name listed for the deceased. Once again, it meant nothing to him. No record, no property ownership, no known family, another ghost added to the parish ledger. But something else about the notice made his stomach tighten. The burial location had been specified unusually clearly. Western ground, beside the church wall. The same place Hale had dug the night before. He suddenly realized something chilling. A new coffin was about to be buried in the exact area where the weapon caches were hidden, which meant more muskets might already be on their way. That night, Hale returned to the documents he had copied earlier. The coded phrases inside Whitford's letter now carried a very different meaning. Deliveries to be received after midnight. Storage beneath the western foundation remained secure. Coffins required to maintain appearances. It was all there. It's plainly hidden in the open. Yet another thought crept slowly into Hale's mind. If these weapons were meant for colonial rebels, Whitford might secretly be supporting the coming revolution. But if they were meant for British loyalists, the church might be arming forces against the colonists themselves. Both possibilities were dangerous, But one possibility was even worse. What if Whitford was supplying both sides? In times of political chaos, weapons could become the most profitable commodity of all. That evening, Hale left the print shop later than usual. As he stepped into the narrow street, he noticed something unusual. A man stood across the road near a tavern doorway. Watching him, the stranger wore a dark riding coat and wide-brimmed hat pulled low across his face. The moment Hale looked in his direction, the man turned and walked away. The movement seemed deliberate, too deliberate. Hale tried to dismiss the thought. Williamsburg was full of travelers and merchants. But as he walked home, he heard footsteps behind him more than once, always at a distance, always disappearing when he turned. Perhaps it was nothing, but the sense of being observed refused to fade. 2 days later, another unsettling event occurred. One of the workers who had occasionally helped dig graves at Whitford's parish suddenly fell ill. The man's name was Samuel Darnell, a laborer known for taking odd jobs across nearby farms. Hale had spoken with him briefly months earlier while gathering parish information. A word spread through the town that Darnell had become violently sick overnight. By the next morning, he was dead. The official explanation was fever, but several witnesses claimed his illness had appeared suddenly and strangely. The man had reportedly tried to speak during his final hours, but whatever warning he attempted to give was never clearly understood. The rumor unsettled Hale deeply. If Darnell had been involved in the burial work at the churchyard, he might have known about the hidden weapons, and now he was dead. Whether by coincidence or not, Hale could not say, but the timing felt ominous. 3 nights before the scheduled funeral, Hale returned once more to the parish church. This time he came earlier in the evening, hiding among the trees before darkness fully settled. He wanted to see who delivered the coffins and who collected them. The hours passed slowly. The churchyard remained silent. But just after midnight, the distant sound of wagon wheels reached his ears. Lanterns appeared along the dirt road. A small wagon approached the church. 2 men rode beside it. Hale leaned forward carefully. The wagon carried 3 long wooden boxes, coffins. The men unloaded them quickly. But as they carried the first coffin toward the western wall, the church door opened, and Reverend Whitford stepped outside. Even in the dim lantern light, Hale recognized the minister immediately. Whitford spoke briefly with the men. Hale could not hear the words, but he saw the minister gesture toward the foundation hatch. Moments later, the hatch opened again. Coffin disappeared beneath the church. Then the second, then the third. Whitford remained standing outside watching the road, watching the darkness, watching as if he expected someone. For a terrifying moment, Hale wondered if the minister somehow knew he was there. But Whitford eventually returned inside the church. The lanterns vanished, the wagon departed, and the churchyard fell silent once more. Hal waited until nearly dawn before leaving. His mind raced the entire ride back to Williamsburg. The evidence was now undeniable. Reverend Whitford was directly involved. The church itself was serving as a secret weapons depot, but Hale still did not know the full purpose of the operation until the following afternoon. Because when he returned to the printing shop that day, he found something waiting on his work table, a folded piece of paper. No seal, no signature, just a single line written in careful ink. Stop digging in graves that were never meant to be opened. Hal felt a cold chill run through his body. Someone knew. Someone had been watching him. And whoever left that message wanted him to stop. But the warning contained something else as well. A small symbol drawn in the corner. The same triangular mark he had seen inside Whitford's coded letters, which meant the writer belonged to the same hidden network. The same organization moving weapons beneath the church. Hale stared at the message for a long time. Then he slowly folded the paper and placed it inside his coat. Because if the conspiracy had begun sending warnings, it meant he was getting close. Very close. And the coming Sunday funeral might reveal more than anyone expected. Because Hale had already made a decision. When the coffin was lowered into the grave before the entire congregation, he was going to watch every movement, every signal, every man involved. And if the coffin contained weapons once again, he would finally know who controlled the secret buried beneath Whitford's church. But what Hale did not yet realize was that someone else inside the parish had already discovered his investigation. They were preparing to confront him. Soon. Sunday morning arrived under a pale gray sky. The church bell rang slowly across the surrounding farmland, its deep echo carrying through fields of early tobacco and scattered pine forest. Families began arriving before the sun fully cleared the horizon, horses tied to wooden rails. Wagons creaked to a stop along the dirt road. Men in wool coats and broad hats stepped down to help their wives and children from the benches. Their boots carried the dust of farms and plantations. Their conversations were quiet, polite, careful. From a distance, the parish appeared exactly as it had for decades. Orderly, devout, peaceful. But Nathaniel. Hal stood among the arriving congregation with a very different understanding of the place. He now knew what lay beneath the western wall of the church. He knew about the coffins filled with muskets. He knew about the coded letters. He knew that someone had already warned him to stop searching. Yet he had come anyway. Because the funeral scheduled for this morning was not just another burial. It was a moment that could confirm everything. Destroy him. Hale took a place near the back of the churchyard, careful to remain among the cluster of farmers and tradesmen who had gathered beside the cemetery fence. From here, he could see both the western wall of the church and the open grave that had already been prepared. The soil beside it looked freshly turned. The coffin rested nearby on a wooden stand. 6 men waited beside it, gravediggers, but Hale recognized only 2 of them from previous parish records. The other 4 were strangers. That detail alone was enough to tighten the tension in his chest. If outsiders were now being used for the burial work, it meant the operation was becoming more careful, more controlled, and possibly more dangerous. The church doors opened. The congregation moved slowly inside. Nathaniel followed with the others. Inside the building, sunlight filtered through tall rectangular windows and illuminated the familiar interior. Long wooden pews, whitewashed walls, and the raised pulpit where Reverend Elias Whitford stood waiting. The minister appeared calm, composed. His gray hair was neatly tied behind his collar, and his black clerical coat hung perfectly straight. He began the service with quiet authority. "Man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live." The words echoed through the wooden chamber. Most of the congregation listened with bowed heads. But Nathaniel Hale watched the minister closely. Whitford's voice never wavered. His expression remained solemn. Yet there was something in the way his eyes moved through the room, brief glances that seemed to measure the people before him. Not the gaze of a man offering comfort. The gaze of a man calculating something. Hall wondered how long Whitford had been doing this. How long the church had been used as a hidden storehouse for weapons. How many of the 157 coffins had contained muskets instead of bodies? Most importantly, why? But before we follow Nathaniel further into that question, we must understand the man himself. Because Nathaniel Hale was not a soldier, he was not a politician, and he certainly was not a revolutionary leader. He was a printer's apprentice. Born to a modest family in Williamsburg, Hale had grown up surrounded by paper, ink, and the quiet machinery of information. His father had worked as a bookbinder before illness took him when Nathaniel was 14. Printing became Nathaniel's trade almost by accident. Yet over time, it shaped the way he saw the world. Printers learned something most people did not. They saw ideas before those ideas reached the public. They handled sermons before they were spoken. Pamphlets before they were distributed. Political arguments before they were debated in taverns or assemblies. Through ink and paper, Nathaniel had witnessed the slow transformation of colonial society. He had seen the arguments against British taxation grow sharper. He had read essays calling for independence long before such words were spoken openly. But Nathaniel Hale was not driven by politics. His strength lay elsewhere. Curiosity, the relentless need to understand the truth hidden beneath official words. Yet that strength also carried a weakness. Nathaniel was not a man trained for danger. He had no allies among powerful landowners. No authority within the church. And now, by uncovering the secret of the empty coffins, he had placed himself directly between forces far larger than himself. As the funeral service ended, the congregation slowly moved outside. The coffin was lifted onto ropes. The gravediggers carried it toward the open grave beside the western wall. Nathaniel watched every step. But while Nathaniel struggled with uncertainty, Reverend Elias Whitford lived with absolute conviction. Whitford had arrived in Virginia more than a decade earlier. His background was not humble. He had studied theology in London and served briefly under Anglican authorities who closely monitored colonial loyalty to the crown. To Whitford, the American colonies represented something fragile, an empire built on order, hierarchy, and divine authority. But by the 1770s, Whitford believed that order was collapsing. He had seen colonial assemblies openly challenge British law, merchants refusing royal taxation, farmers forming armed militias. To Whitford, rebellion was not merely political, it was spiritual decay, a rejection of God's ordained structure. And men who rejected divine authority often turned to chaos, violence, anarchy. Whitford believed he was standing against that chaos. But his solution was not simple loyalty to the crown. It was something far more complicated. Because Whitford understood that wars were not won by sermons. They were won by weapons. Weapons placed into the right hands, sometimes hidden in the most unlikely places. Like church coffins. Yet Whitford was not alone in this belief. Around him moved several supporting figures, each trapped between loyalty and fear. Among them was Thomas Ridley, a member of the parish vestry. Ridley owned a modest tobacco plantation nearby and held influence within the community. Publicly, he supported Whitford's leadership and defended the church against criticism. But privately, Ridley had begun questioning the minister's actions. He had seen shipments arrive at strange hours. He had heard whispers from laborers who worked near the western wall. And more recently, he had noticed Nathaniel Hale watching the churchyard. Ridley's loyalty to the church was real, but so was his fear. If the hidden weapons were discovered, the consequences could destroy the entire parish, perhaps even bring British soldiers down upon them. Yet another figure moved quietly within the shadows of this unfolding drama, a young servant named Abigail Turner. Abigail worked inside the church building itself, cleaning the pews, lighting candles, and assisting with parish records. Few people noticed her, which made her dangerous in a different way, because Abigail had seen things. She had seen the hatch beneath the western foundation open during the night. She had seen men carrying crates that did not resemble religious supplies, and more than once she had seen Reverend Whitford reading letters that he quickly burned afterward. Abigail did not know the full truth, but she knew enough to understand that something powerful was being hidden. And now she had begun noticing Nathaniel Hale, his watchful eyes, his quiet questions. Two people searching for answers in a place built on silence. Back in the churchyard, the coffin was now being lowered into the grave. The congregation stood in respectful silence. Ropes creaked softly. Earth shifted beneath boots. Nathaniel watched the men handling the coffin. One of them looked familiar. Not from the parish, from Williamsburg. The man had once delivered crates to the printing shop warehouse, crates marked with military shipping stamps. The connection struck Nathaniel like lightning. This was no random operation. The same transport network moving goods through Williamsburg was also supplying Whitford's church, which meant the conspiracy extended far beyond the parish, possibly into the colonial trade system itself. As the coffin reached the bottom of the grave, Nathaniel noticed something else. Reverend Whitford stepped closer to the edge, and for just a moment, the minister looked directly at him. Their eyes met. Not briefly, not by accident. Whitford held Nathaniel's gaze for several long seconds. There was no confusion in that expression, no surprise, only quiet recognition, something even colder, understanding. Nathaniel felt the realization settle heavily in his chest. Whitford knew. He knew about the investigation. The warning letter, perhaps even the grave Nathaniel had opened. The moment passed quickly. Whitford returned his attention to the burial prayers. But the balance of power had shifted. Nathaniel was no longer observing from the shadows. He had been seen. The service ended. The congregation began drifting away across the churchyard. But Nathaniel remained standing near the fence, watching the minister. And in that silent moment between them, Nathaniel made a decision. He could leave. Return to Williamsburg. Forget what he had discovered. But if he did, the weapons beneath that church would continue moving, quietly, unchallenged, into a war that had not yet fully begun. Nathaniel Hale took a slow breath. Then he stepped away from the crowd, began walking directly toward Reverend Elias Whitford. The wind had begun to rise across the churchyard. Loose soil from the newly filled grave shifted slightly as the last members of the congregation walked away toward the dirt road. Most believed the service was finished. The coffin had been lowered. The prayers had been spoken. Life would now continue, as it always had, in the quiet Virginia parish. But Nathaniel Hale knew something very different had just begun. He walked across the grass slowly, each step measured. Reverend Elias Whitford remained near the grave, speaking briefly with two members of the vestry. Their conversation stopped the moment Nathaniel approached. For several seconds, no one spoke. Whitford studied the young printer with calm curiosity. The vestrymen exchanged uncertain glances. Nathaniel could feel their attention weighing on him. Still, he did not stop walking. He stopped only a few feet from the minister. "Reverend Whitford," he said quietly. Whitford nodded once. "Mr. Hale," the minister replied. The tone carried no surprise, no confusion. Only a controlled politeness that made Nathaniel's unease deepen. "I was not aware you attended our parish," Whitford continued. "I do not," Nathaniel answered. "Then perhaps you are here today for reasons beyond prayer." The words hung between them. The vestryman shifted slightly beside the minister, suddenly alert to the tension rising beneath the conversation. Nathaniel knew this moment could not be taken back, but neither could the truth he had uncovered. "I have been reviewing certain burial records," Nathaniel said carefully. Whitford remained silent. "All the numbers are unusual." The minister's eyes narrowed slightly. "How so?" Nathaniel held his gaze. 157 burials within 12 years, the wind moved through the trees again. Several parishioners lingering nearby turned their heads slightly, sensing the conversation had taken an unusual direction. Whitford spoke calmly. "Visits us all, Mr. Hale. In these colonies, it visits frequently." Nathaniel nodded. "That may be true." Then he added quietly, "But coffins rarely contain muskets." The words fell like a stone into still water. One of the vestrymen gasped softly. The other stepped backward. Whitford did not move. But something changed in his expression. Not panic, not anger. Recognition. The minister slowly folded his hands behind his back. "You should be careful with accusations," Whitford said. Nathaniel did not look away. "I opened a grave," he replied. The confession caused visible shock among the nearby parishioners. Voices began murmuring across the churchyard. A woman pulled her child closer. One of the vestrymen spoke sharply. "You desecrated consecrated ground." Nathaniel ignored him. His attention remained fixed on Whitford. Inside the church building, the door opened quietly. Abigail Turner stepped outside, drawn by the rising tension. She froze when she saw the gathering forming around the grave. The minister looked toward the growing crowd, then back to Nathaniel. "You are a printer's apprentice," Whitford said calmly, "not an investigator." Nathaniel felt the weight of every eye in the churchyard, but he continued. "Then explain the coffins." Silence followed, long enough for the whispers to spread across the congregation. Several farmers stepped closer. One of them spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "What coffins?" Another voice joined. "He says the graves are empty." The murmur grew louder. Confusion moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Whitford raised one hand. A simple gesture restored silence almost instantly. That alone revealed how much authority he held over the parish. "My friends," Whitford said, addressing the congregation, "there are times when fear causes men to misunderstand what they see." He gestured toward Nathaniel. "This young man has allowed curiosity to overcome judgment." Nathaniel felt the moment slipping. Whitford was reclaiming control of the narrative, carefully, skillfully, like a man who had faced accusations before. But Nathaniel had one advantage: the truth. "He saw the hatch beneath the church foundation," he said loudly. The words cut through the air. More gasps. Now even the vestrymen looked uncertain. Whitford's calm expression tightened slightly. Nathaniel continued. "I saw coffins delivered at night." Murmurs erupted. Coffins taken beneath the church instead of buried. Several men in the crowd exchanged uneasy looks. One farmer stepped forward. "Gosh, Reverend, is that true?" Whitford remained silent for a moment. Then he did something unexpected. He did not deny it. Instead, he turned slowly toward the congregation. "Yes," Whitford said. The crowd fell completely silent. "Yes, the church has received shipments." A wave of confusion spread through the listeners. Nathaniel felt his heart pound. Whitford was admitting part of the truth, but not all of it. The minister continued calmly. Our colony stands at the edge of war. The statement caused another ripple through the crowd. Everyone in Virginia had heard rumors, militia drills, protests against British rule, the growing tension between loyalists and revolutionaries, but hearing it spoken openly by a minister felt different, more serious. Whitford's voice grew stronger. If violence reaches our shores, this parish will not remain untouched. He paused. And I will not allow my people to stand defenseless. Nathaniel felt the meaning strike him instantly. Whitford turned back toward him. The muskets you discovered are not part of a crime. The minister's eyes hardened. Their preparation. Gasps spread across the churchyard. Preparation for war. Whitford continued. The crown may send soldiers. Rebels may march through our lands. Law may collapse, but this parish will survive. The declaration created a wave of conflicting reactions. Some men nodded. Others looked frightened, because the truth was unavoidable. If weapons were being stored secretly in the church, the entire community could be accused of treason. British authorities had already begun cracking down on colonial militias. Discovery could bring arrests, confiscations, even execution. Thomas Ridley stepped forward, his face pale. Reverend, you never told the vestry about this? Whitford looked at him calmly. Some burdens cannot be shared widely. Ridley's voice shook. You turned the church into an armory. Whitford's answer came without hesitation. I turned it into a shield. The words echoed heavily across the churchyard. Nathaniel realized something terrifying in that moment. Whitford truly believed he was protecting the community. This was not greed, not simple rebellion. It was ideology, conviction, which made him far more dangerous. Nathaniel spoke again. But the coffins, he said. Whitford's gaze returned to him. Yes, the minister replied quietly. The coffins. He stepped closer to Nathaniel, close enough that only a few nearby listeners could hear his next words. You should ask yourself something, Mr. Hale. Nathaniel waited. Whitford leaned slightly closer. If the coffins were meant only for weapons, his voice lowered, then why does the burial ledger contain so many names? Nathaniel felt the ground shift beneath his understanding. Whitford straightened again. The minister raised his voice for the congregation. Our colony faces uncertain days. We must prepare. But the crowd was no longer calm. Fear had entered their thoughts. What if British authorities discovered the weapons? What if rebels demanded them? What if their peaceful parish became a battlefield? The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were real. They touched every person standing there. Abigail Turner watched the scene from near the church door, her hands trembling. She understood something others did not. If the conspiracy had grown this large, there were people outside the parish involved. Powerful people, merchants, transporters, possibly even political leaders. Nathaniel's accusation had just exposed something far bigger than one church, far bigger than one minister. And that meant someone might now try to silence him. Whitford stepped away from the grave. The congregation parted as he moved through them. But before entering the church again, he stopped and turned. His eyes met Nathaniel's one last time. You asked about the coffins, Whitford said. Nathaniel waited. The minister's voice carried clearly across the churchyard. Perhaps you should ask yourself a different question. Nathaniel felt a chill. Whitford's expression turned darker. How many of those 157 names, he paused, were never meant to be found? The words struck like thunder. A terrible possibility suddenly opened in Nathaniel's mind. What if some of the coffins had not been empty? What if the burial ledger had not been entirely false? What if the churchyard was hiding something far worse than weapons? Whitford entered the church. The door closed behind him. And in that moment Nathaniel realized the truth. The conspiracy beneath the church was not only about war. It was about people who had disappeared, and some of those 157 coffins might still contain bodies. The church bell did not ring that evening. For the first time in years, the parish grounds stood silent after sunset. The congregation had dispersed hours earlier, but the tension from the confrontation in the churchyard still hung over the land like a storm waiting to break. Nathaniel Hale had not returned to Williamsburg. Instead, he remained near the parish, hidden among the tree line overlooking the church. He knew something was coming. Reverend Whitford's final words had changed everything. How many of those 157 names were never meant to be found? The question echoed inside Nathaniel's mind again and again. Weapons hidden in coffins had been shocking enough. But if even a portion of those graves contained real victims, then the conspiracy beneath the church was no longer about war preparation. It was something darker, much darker. Night settled over the countryside slowly. The moon rose pale above the tobacco fields, casting silver light across the church roof and cemetery stones. Nathaniel waited. Hours passed. Just when exhaustion began creeping into his bones, a distant lantern appeared along the road. Then another, and another. A small group of riders approached the church. They moved quickly, but cautiously. Nathaniel recognized one of them immediately. Thomas Ridley, the vestryman. But Ridley was not alone. 5 other men rode with him. None of them were parish farmers. Their coats were heavier, their posture straighter. Even in the dim lantern light, Nathaniel recognized the discipline in the way they carried themselves. Soldiers or men accustomed to command. The riders dismounted near the church door. Ridley knocked once. The door opened almost instantly. Reverend Whitford stepped outside. For several moments, the men spoke quietly. Nathaniel could not hear their conversation, but the tension in their body language was unmistakable. Ridley appeared agitated. Whitford remained calm. Eventually, the group moved toward the western side of the church, toward the hidden hatch beneath the foundation. Nathaniel's heart pounded. He crept closer through the shadows, careful not to make a sound. The hatch was opened. Lantern light spilled into the darkness beneath the church. One by one, the men disappeared inside. Nathaniel hesitated only a moment. Then he followed. The entrance tunnel beneath the foundation was narrow and damp. Stone walls pressed close on both sides. The air smelled of earth, oilcloth, and iron. Nathaniel moved slowly down the passage until the tunnel widened into a hidden chamber. What he saw there stopped him cold. The space beneath the church was enormous, far larger than the foundation alone could explain. Rows of wooden crates lined the walls, some open, some sealed. Weapons filled nearly every corner. Muskets, powder barrels, bayonets. Enough arms to supply an entire militia company, or perhaps several. Lanterns burned across the chamber, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Whitford stood near the center of the room with the arriving riders. Ridley faced him, his voice raised in anger. "You should have told us the truth." Whitford did not flinch. "I told you what was necessary." Ridley gestured toward the surrounding crates. "This is not protection. This is a war depot." One of the soldiers spoke. "British patrols are already searching warehouses in Norfolk," another added quietly. "If they find this place, every man in this room will hang." Nathaniel pressed himself against the tunnel wall, listening. Whitford's voice remained steady. "The Crown already considers rebellion inevitable." Ridley shook his head. "You are making it inevitable." Whitford stepped closer. "No, Thomas. I'm preparing for it." Ridley's frustration broke into something deeper. "Fear, and the people in those graves," he demanded. Whitford paused. For the first time that night, his composure cracked slightly. The chamber fell silent. Ridley continued. "You told us the coffins were empty?" Whitford's answer came slowly. Most of them were. The words chilled the room. Ridley's voice dropped. "And the rest?" Whitford did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly between the weapon crates. His lantern light flickered across the chamber walls. "When shipments first began," Whitford said quietly, "we needed secrecy." Ridley's expression darkened. Whitford continued. "Several men discovered what we were doing." Nathaniel felt his breath catch in his throat. "They threatened to report it to Colonial authorities," Ridley whispered. "So you buried them." Whitford closed his eyes briefly. "I buried the problem." Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. Nathaniel suddenly understood the horrifying truth. The burial ledger had not been entirely false. Some of the 157 names had been real. Men who had seen too much. Men who had threatened the conspiracy. Men who had vanished beneath sacred ground. Ridley's voice trembled with anger. He turned a church into a graveyard for secrets. Whitford met his gaze. turned it into the foundation of survival. The soldiers exchanged uneasy looks. One of them spoke. "This ends tonight." Whitford looked at him calmly. "Does it?" The man stepped forward. "We cannot carry this sin into the coming war." Whitford's voice hardened. "The war will not care about our sins." The tension in the chamber had become unbearable. Ow. Ridley drew a pistol. The sound of the hammer clicking echoed through the underground space. Whitford did not move. "If you kill me," the minister said quietly, "you destroy the only system keeping this operation organized." Ridley's hand shook. "You already destroyed it." Nathaniel knew he could not remain hidden any longer. Too much had been revealed. Too much had been lost. He stepped into the lantern light. Every man in the chamber turned. Whitford's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Hale." Ridley looked stunned. "You followed us?" Nathaniel nodded. "You buried men to protect weapons." Whitford answered simply. "I buried them to protect the colony." Nathaniel looked around the chamber, at the crates, at the muskets, at the shadows of the church above them. He turned faith into a cover for war. Whitford's voice softened. "Faith has always stood beside war." Nathaniel realized something then. Whitford truly believed his actions had been necessary. In his mind, the weapons would protect the colony when violence arrived. The deaths were collateral. A terrible price for what he believed was a greater survival. Ridley lowered his pistol slowly, not in forgiveness, but in exhaustion. "We cannot hide this anymore." The soldiers nodded. The truth was unavoidable. The weapons would have to be moved. The graves investigated. The church's secrets exposed. Whitford understood this as well. His shoulders sank slightly. "The war will begin soon," he said quietly. "When it does, none of this will matter." Nathaniel shook his head. "It will matter to the men you buried." Whitford said nothing. Above them, the wind moved through the churchyard. The foundations creaked softly. Within weeks, the first full battles of the American Revolution would erupt across the colonies. Militias would rise. British armies would march. And many of the muskets hidden beneath that church would eventually find their way into soldiers' hands. History would remember the war, the victories, the founding of a new nation. But it would not remember the church where some of those weapons had been hidden, or the graves that had protected them. In the years that followed, the parish church fell slowly into ruin. Records disappeared during the chaos of war. Storms damaged the roof. The western foundation collapsed decades later. When repairs were attempted, workers discovered only fragments of the underground chamber. Most of the crates were gone. The hatch had rotted away, and the burial ground still held its quiet rows of weathered stones. But investigators who examined several graves made a strange discovery. Some coffins contained nothing but straw, others contained rusted weapon parts, and a few contained human remains. Yet the burial ledger still listed 157 names, many of which could never be traced to real people. Some historians believe those names were invented to disguise the movement of weapons. Others believe they represented victims whose identities were deliberately erased. The truth may never be fully known, but one fact remains certain. Beneath that small colonial church, faith and power became tangled with fear, and the cost of secrecy was measured in graves. Because history is not only shaped by the battles we remember, it is also shaped by the shadows beneath sacred places. And sometimes the darkest stories are hidden where no one thinks to look. Beneath the foundations of a church, beneath the silence of a graveyard, beneath the weight of 157 coffins, some empty, some not. And even today, historians still debate what truly happened in that forgotten parish. But one question remains.